It's pretty damn easy to find a good fighting game on the Sega Saturn. Hell, it's even easy to find a great fighting game on the Sega Saturn. Often lost in this shuffle of greatness is Sega's own offerings for the system. The majority of these games were polygon based and not held in the same esteem as their 2D counterparts. But that doesn't mean they weren't fantastic games. In this episode, we are going to look at the 8 fighting games that Sega would develop and publish for the Saturn, and whether or not they are worth your time today. I hope you guys enjoy the Sega fighting games for the Sega Saturn. There's no better place to start than with the game that launched the Saturn in November of 1994, Virtua Fighter. Originally produced on the Model 1 arcade hardware by AM2, the Saturn port would be developed hand in hand with the system itself. The final product would be a mixed bag of compromise because of that, suffering from graphical glitches in the form of polygon dropout, as well as the trade-off of a lower polygon count and frame rate than the arcade on which it's based. This didn't matter in Japan at all, where Virtua Fighter would launch the system to stellar sales and reviews, and secure the Saturn as a big hit in its home territory. But Sega would take a black eye in the Western magazines of the time, mainly because the flat-shaded Virtua Fighter looked so dated next to its fully textured-mapped competition from Sony, Battle Arena Toshinden. This was honestly a shame, because while Virtua Fighter certainly wasn't arcade-perfect visually, its gameplay was leaps and bounds superior to Toshinden in every way. Its combo system was smoother and animated better, and the fighting styles were all based on real martial arts techniques, instead of the flashy special moves that dominated Toshinden's play. The biggest flaw of the game rested on the fact that AM2 didn't add any real extras into the home version. There is no story of any kind in the game itself, nor endings, nor unlockable characters, nor anything else for that matter. In effect, the game lacked personality, something Toshinden actually had. Today, Virtua Fighter is rarely considered anything more than a bad port that punctuated the tough early days of the Saturn existence in the West, but I don't agree. In the land of retro gaming, gameplay is king, and Virtua Fighter is still one great playing fighting game. The wealth of moves, variety of styles, and great animation add up to a fighting game that can still provide one heck of a good time. It's also cheap as hell in every region due to the sheer volume of units still in the wild, rarely costing more than $5 or $10 complete.
Ring out!
Sega would enlist AM1 to help with a full graphical update to Virtua Fighter, releasing Virtua Fighter Remix in July of 1995. Addressing the dated look of the original game's flat-shaded polygons, this new entry is now fully textured mapped, has a ring that is rendered beautifully by VDP2, and even has some gameplay improvements. They also fixed the vast majority of the polygon glitches from the original game, giving us a new package that quite honestly should have been the original game to begin with. The upgraded graphics truly do look great, and the gameplay suffers no trade-offs in the process. You do lose the original game's lighting engine, but since most of the stages were in daylight anyway, it's something you won't really miss. If you found the flat-shaded visuals of the first off-putting, you should definitely give this one a look. Sega would also release this version of the game in the arcades on its Saturn-based Titan board. It's pretty much a one-to-one copy of what we got at home, though it's fairly rare to find the Western version intact in its original cabinet. Luckily, the Saturn version is really easy to find cheap in most territories, with only the Western big box retail releases commanding any real investment. Lost in the shuffle of all the 3D polygon talk was Golden Axe To Duel, a September 1995 release that would be based on the world and characters from the classic Sega arcade game. Instead of being a beat 'em up though, Sega decided to make it a one-on-one 2D fighting game, An odd and infuriating decision since the System 32 classic, Golden Axe: The Revenge of Death Adder, was just begging to be brought home to a system as powerful as the Saturn. As a fighting game, Golden Axe: To Duel isn't a bad experience though. The color and animation are actually top notch, with truly incredible detail strewn throughout the entire presentation. Sprites are big and the backdrops create a compelling environment to fight against. The gameplay mostly follows your typical Street Fighter II flow, with quarter circle, half circle, and charge motions dominating the special attacks. If I had to level a criticism at this one, it's that nobody really asked for a Golden Axe fighting game. There was already a Golden Axe game that needed a Saturn port, and I think that bitterness really turned me against this one. While it isn't what I wanted, I can say that it might be worth a look should you want a decent playing 2D fighter on the Saturn. It was also released on Sega's Titan arcade board, where it would have different music and more frames of animation in both the characters and backgrounds. The Western releases of this cost way more than they should, so if a physical copy is what you're after, go with the Japanese release. With Sega having a strong 1995 in Japan, and being ripped apart in North America during the same time period, Virtua Fighter 2 was meant to be a silver bullet in every territory. Released in December of 1995, it was meant to solidify the Saturn's strength in Japan while repairing some of its own image in the West. AM2 set out to make a version of the cutting-edge Model 2 arcade game that took advantage of the Saturn's hardware in every way. And in my opinion, they succeeded and then some. Utilizing the Saturn's high-resolution mode of 704 by 480, AM2 was able to give us the 60 frames per second gameplay of the arcade intact, with the only notable sacrifices being the 3D backgrounds and lower polygon counts on the fighters. The higher res and great color and texture work on the fighters does much to mitigate these trade-offs, but some of the 3D backgrounds like the bridge stage are still missed. The game still looks incredible however, and really showed just how far Saturn development had come. In the span of only a year, Sega had gone from the glitchy, flat-shaded Virtua Fighter 1 to the much better looking texture-mapped Virtua Fighter Remix to the high-res 60 frames per second beauty here. It was a compelling argument for the Saturn hardware having a lot more potential hidden within its complicated internals than previously suspected. AM2 was good enough to add some really cool additions to the home release as well, including a watch mode that allowed you to see the CPU battle it out against itself, an AI learning mode that learned how you played to make for a better opponent, and a host of options like team battle and ranking modes. Virtua Fighter 2 would go on to be the Saturn's best-selling game in Japan, and propel the system to sell much better than its rivals at the end of the year. It did provide a bump in sales for the Saturn in the West, but it was much smaller and not enough to hold any real momentum. Fortunately today, Virtua Fighter 2 is cheap in every region and is a great fighting game for those wanting some serious challenge.
Ready, go!
With its Virtua Fighter series having come a long way on the Saturn, Sega decided to try and make it more friendly to younger gamers with the release of Virtua Fighter Kids in July of 1996. Now with a host of options and gameplay changes to make it more appealing to the less hardcore crowd, it would also undergo some radical changes in presentation. Both the visuals and music have been made softer and cuter, but the game still retains many of the elements that made Virtua Fighter 2 so impressive, like the high-res mode and 60 frames per second. Despite the cutesy makeover, there's still a serious fighting game engine here, and it's still capable of giving you a heck of a challenge on the higher levels. This would see an arcade version released around the same time on Sega's Titan board, though it's rare as all get out in the US and Europe. It's relatively inexpensive everywhere on the Saturn though, and the Japanese version goes for hardly anything even at websites like eBay. AM2 was quick to get back to porting Model 2 arcade games to Saturn with Fighting Vipers, being released in August of 1996. Heavily influenced by the gameplay of Virtua Fighter, this adds caged arenas to the mix, as well as armor-clad combatants. Time your power moves correctly, and you can strip away your opponent's armor to deal far more damage. Time your power moves when their life is low, and you can send them flying through the cage in spectacular fashion. What Fighting Vipers ultimately aims to be is a flashier and more exciting Virtua Fighter, and in that respect, it succeeds incredibly. You'll find yourself trying to strip your opponent's armor and send them flying through the cage more often than not, adding a new dimension to this style of game from Sega. AM2 was also intent on preserving a similar lighting system that was present in the arcade, choosing to use different shading techniques instead of the high-res mode of the Saturn. This gives the game a rougher appearance than Virtua Fighter 2, though it does retain the 3D cages from the arcade. If you found yourself looking for something flashier and more frantic than Virtua Fighter, you may like Fighting Vipers here. Again, you can find most regions of this game really cheap, but the Japanese version again goes for hardly anything. Go. Sega would close out 1996 with the December release of Fighters Megamix. This mashup of all of AM2's fighting games primarily focused on Virtua Fighter and Fighting Vipers, but also had the characters from many other Sega franchises, including Virtua Cop, Daytona USA, Sonic, and even Rent-A-Hero. The gameplay here was also a radical upgrade over previous games from AM2, with many of the moves from Virtua Fighter 3 being used, as well as a ton of upgrades to the Fighting Viper style play. The best part of this package is how it differs from what Sega had done before it, however. Now loaded with a bunch of hidden characters, content, and additional gameplay modes, Sega had finally understood that its games needed to be more than simple arcade ports. There was so much here to see and do, adding up to a package that was more akin to what Namco was doing on the PlayStation than what Saturn fans had seen in previous Sega efforts. The 3D engine on display was also vastly improved over what we had seen in Fighting Vipers, with even a return of the fully 3D plane taking off on Tokyo stage, and an overall improvement in detail and backgrounds and characters. Of all the fighting games Sega made for the Saturn themselves, this here was the only one that did not have an arcade version of any kind. I can't help but think that helped this game immensely, allowing AM2's imagination to run wild and create something truly special for the system. With its great content and gameplay, it's easily one of the best 3D fighting games on the system, and one I recommend all day long to anyone looking for something unique. Surprisingly, Fighters Megamix doesn't sell for a lot even today, and as usual, the Japanese version is the cheapest by quite a stretch.
Ready, go!
The last fighting game Sega would make internally was Last Bronx, released in August of 1997 and developed by AM3. This port of the Model 2 arcade game sought to combine a number of elements from AM2's fighting games, while adding weapons to the mix. The end result is one of the hardest and best looking 3D fighters you'll find on the system. The graphics here feature some great texture and polygon work for the time, and there is heavy implementation of VDP2 for the backgrounds. This allowed some stages a depth previously not seen in AM2's efforts, and a great look into what Saturn development could have evolved into had the system been more successful. There's also a ton of extras included in the home release, including survival, time attack, watch, and practice modes, as well as a host of unlockable art and video. The meek need not apply to this one, however, as the aggressive AI is ruthless even on the easier settings. It doesn't simply come at you haphazardly, instead coming at you measured, waiting for you to make a mistake. This level of difficulty can be frustrating, but also rewarding once you get the timing and feel down. The great mix of content, graphics, and gameplay make it one of the stronger fighting games on the Saturn, and it, like most of Sega's efforts, doesn't cost a fortune today. The Japanese version is of course much cheaper than its Western variants, and I have no problem recommending it to those of you wanting a challenging game with some solid visuals. There we go guys, Sega's fighting games on the Sega Saturn. My single biggest criticism of Sega's efforts here is the lack of extra content most of these games had. They were often simple ports of the arcade release with an extra mode or two. Other arcade fighting game makers quickly realized that things like hidden characters, stages, bosses, stories, endings, and even mini-games went a long way when an arcade game was brought home. It took Sega far too long with Fighters Megamix in late 1996, a full 2 years after the Saturn's debut, to give us something of similar content. Outside of that though, every single one of these games provides a fun and unique experience, and many of them represent the best technical feats the Saturn was capable of pulling off. Since nearly all of these are bought for well under $20 in their Japanese form, there really is no reason a fighting game fan shouldn't own every single one of them for his or her Saturn. You'll be hard pressed to find better 3D fighting games on the system. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.